Waiting, I'll steal a line from my buddy Steve here in the front row about opportunity cost. I realize the cost, this goes out to our organizers, I realize the cost may have been prohibitive, but you missed a good opportunity to have some catfish on the No, Ryan and his group and Cicero's do a great job, probably one of the best, certainly, I think, in the Delta, and what they do with catfish. So that's my commodity plug. I'll take that shirt off after a while. So with that, Bruce and Andy kind of wanted us to start off this second panel discussion session here. We'll start off with kind of we'll offer our panelists another kind of either a summary, both of our discussions from our first session, and also kind of lead us off onto what we need to cover in this next session as well. So kind of a wrap up from where we were and some new things we might need to discuss during this session. As someone said a minute ago, thanks for getting us to lunch today. Well, my goal now is to either get you to the break or to the parking lot, one or the other. So we'll try to keep that in mind as we go forward. With that, we'll start off in the same order as we did the first session.
I guess I'm starting first. Is this thing on?
Yeah, that's on.
Close to your mouth. Close to your mouth.
Okay. Well, actually, my, way of looking at what we did this morning was a little more of an adversarial approach than I would love to have seen, but I think we've accomplished a lot. But I think what we need to recognize that all parties here really want to accomplish the same objective. I don't think we have a big objective difference in this whole thing. The foresters want to accomplish management of the stand as well as good wildlife habitat production. And I think the wildlife biologists recognize that we're going to have good forest management as well to keep this thing going. So what I think we ought to concentrate on now is trying to find some way that we can reconcile the two objectives in some way. And I think that means that we're going to have to look at not just regeneration. We put too much emphasis on regeneration. Regeneration is just one aspect of it. And what we need is to talk about how we manage these stands over time, including regeneration, that will accomplish both the wildlife and the forestry objectives.
Okay. From an economic standpoint, hardwood management has always been a little iffy simply because of the long horizons from start to finish. As Dr. Chang mentioned yesterday, $1,000 40 years from now is worth only about $67 today. So that gives you some idea of how much you can afford to pay for future harvest and future benefits. But one economic principle that is very important to this whole discussion is flexibility. We don't know what the future is, but whatever you plan has to be flexible enough that 10 years from now, 20 years from now down the line, you can shift gears and go in a different direction and still have all the necessary components. So be thinking about that when you're talking about your silvicultural prescriptions. Do we still have the options to go this way or that way, or are we putting ourselves in a box that we can't get out of? And that would be my economic input on this discussion so far.
I guess what I see is that I personally, in a fairly long career, have never been to a meeting that had as many biologists and foresters at the same meeting. That's kind of interesting because we're out there walking in the same tracks, a lot of times talking to the same landowners, and we're coming from very different points of view on the same resource. So I would think there's got to be plenty of room for coming together, and that obviously that we can do best for that landowner, but also not forget the resource and what bird communities need, mammal communities, all of that. So I think it's the problem of the two department heads that somehow y'all screwed that up after somehow put some division at that school and we go to different planets after.
So just to start with, one quick comment, just to clarify and for the record, Dr. Henderson and I have, so to speak, kissed and made up, shook hands. We agreed to move forward, collaborative research, so we're all good on that front. I don't have much to say past that other than echo what everybody said down the table here. I think John was right. We kind of all have the common objective, and that's, to protect, conserve, sustain forests and wetlands and the MAV and the associated bottoms. So how do we all work together to get there? It's the real question. And embedded within that, I made a couple of notes, and it's been said a couple of times, there's some terminology and definitions that need to be set clear so that everybody's on the same page. A lot of it has to do with what Norman just said. There's a lot of biologists in the room, and we may have, and I'm probably guilty as anybody, of misusing terminology. So y'all get us all straight on that. Past that, digging a little deeper, I think there's, what I've heard is, the word regeneration keeps getting thrown around. Well, we're regenerating red oaks. Well, are we establishing red oaks, or are we releasing, perpetuate those to the canopy? I think Emil's tried to articulate that a couple of times, that's really, we're confusing two different subjects there. So I think we need to get a little bit clearer on that. And related to that is the term or the definition of sustainability. What does that mean? Heard Dan say he's talking about, birds or wildlife. There's the other one, Emil said red oaks. If Sammy Keene was here, he might be worried about salamanders or water quality. So there's other people not at the table that should be here to answer that. And then past that, my final one is, when we get to that, it's a common definition of success. So if it's red oak sustainability, is it 60% composition, 50%, 30%? What do we call success? What is that sustainable? That hadn't been defined, I don't think. So until we define that, we'll continue to argue over whether or not it works or not, or if it's sustainable or not. So as with anything, there has to be an endpoint that you measure it by.
Okay, we're gonna open it up, and since there's somebody in the room that knows exactly where my office is, I'll go back to Steve Meadows. You had the last question, Steve. I promised I'd give it back to you if we got it.
Steve Meadows, Forest Service here at Stoneville, and all I can remember about what I was going to say was that the Red Sox are playing at 6 o'clock tonight. I better be home in time to watch them. No, what I was going to say was, in response, and what I think Steve Brock was saying was that he looked at photographs or slides from my presentation, which was a timber production presentation. Looked at slides from Buddy's presentation, from Jeff's presentation, more wildlife-oriented presentations, and he saw the same things. Am I right so far? Okay, all right. And we created, through our treatments, my treatments, their treatments, we created at least similar appearing conditions, okay? And those conditions were basically fit in well with the DFCs, I think, okay? Even though each of us created those conditions through a very different objective in mind when we created those conditions. And then towards the end of your comments, I think you said, the difference is, what do we do with those conditions once we've achieved them? Is that right? Okay. And I think that is a difference. Under an even age system, like I was describing, we have a definite plan as to what we're going to do there. And in that particular stand, we were going to come back in roughly 10 years later, and do a regeneration, an even age regeneration cut. Now, whether we were going to do that over a 3-acre area or a 500-acre area, it doesn't matter. It's still a clear cut, and it's still created an even age. It's creating an even age stand. To me, anyway, reading the DFC document, I'm not sure what the plan is for the conditions created through Jeff's treatments and Buddy's treatments, okay? One of the things that Dan pointed out, and was very clear in Dan's presentation, was that those conditions are ephemeral. They disappear. The benefits of those conditions disappear, at least for a number of the bird species, after a period of time. Some shorter than others. Some of the species that he showed didn't have an end because he didn't have enough time and data to show an end. So my point is that in order to continue to benefit from the conditions that you've created through DFC or through a treatment designed to produce DFCs, in order to continue to benefit from that, you need to have a plan as to what you're going to do when the benefits of those conditions begin to disappear. That's my point. That's the only point I have.
Already on. Okay, I'll go back to Stephen pointing me out as one of the opponents of DFCs, and I'm not, honestly. I'm really not. But I'll reiterate what Steve said. What I see is, as I described it, intermediate stand practices in stands perpetually. And we know from our research that we're not going to sustain the prior composition of that stand if we keep entering it perpetually without at some point having a final harvest. And Dan and I had a really good conversation at lunch, and I think we sort of understand each other. You asked if what Buddy and Kenny are doing in Louisiana, if we thought they were sustainable in their practices. Without knowing the opening size, at a glance, I'd say yes. When I looked at Buddy's work, he listed the types of cuts they were doing. Shelter woods and clear cuts were the most prominent cutting they were doing. They recognized at some point in the life of that stand, they have to replace it. And as Dan and I talked about, it's to borrow some physiology lingo that only Dr. Hodges and I know about, it's an unnecessary evil that you have to bring your future stands through this condition that may not be suitable for particular types of wildlife at a point. But at some point you realize there's not enough left there, you have to have a final harvest. Buddy, would you agree with that? Yes.
I said I wasn't talking, I got one comment.
We'll let him finish. Are you finished?
Thought I had one other point, but I think, oh yeah, and then I'll go back to my very first comment whenever I stood up this morning. I said, what I'm seeing, what Buddy described in his presentation is very different from what Jeff described and what I see occurring on the refuge system here in Mississippi.
Okay.
Yeah, my only quick comment would be, to me, the answer to what you just said is really just scale. I mean, in my mind, just as Buddy described those treatments, it's just when you re-enter the scale at which you do removal of the overstory.
That's a very important fine line, the scale.
But it does seem to kind of be the dividing line in this conversation. Because what he and Jeff represented was focused consideration of either the presence of advanced regeneration or the need to develop it and treatments that would allow that to happen. And then what it comes down to is when you re-enter that stand at the pace at which you re-enter it, the scale at which you remove the overstory to advance that regeneration.
Right. And
Either pass the mic back to him so we can get it, or let's go to.
Your call.
Okay, let's go this way now, in front of him.
Buddy Duke with Department of Fisheries. You pretty much answered it for me. I think scale is the issue. We do release in even age groups, patches, whatever you want to call it. Just a little discrepancy about the size of the group necessary. we're not really using group selection to regenerate in the classic sense. We are just regenerating in groups. Most of our entries include a thinning, general thinning. So each group is surrounded by thinnings. And a lot of the stands we work in have shorter trees, not surrounded by a predominance of tall water or species that let more light through. And you can appreciate ground physiology. And we believe we can get red oak through smaller groups than 3 acres, 2 acres. We just, on our situations, we see it in much smaller groups.
It's here in the blue shirt.
Jeff Denman, I'm gonna try to answer about 3 questions. Steve, plan for the next thing you do once you have advanced regeneration. This is not a plan. These are recommendations to implement in people's management plans. But this does say that every 10 to 15 years, the area in question will be evaluated for the need for additional treatments to maintain and achieve desired conditions. In our management plans, we return each, in our particular case, it's 15-year entry cycle, evaluate. If there's a need to add sunshine to the stand, it can be prescribed and implemented.
To that original open.
To that original opening, and usually it's ends up enlarging existing openings, because that's a lot of times where you're releasing that regeneration. It's growing those openings, whatever size they were, to a larger size. We feed oaks a lot more sunlight because it's very well known. As they get to the sapling and pole stage, they are very intolerant of shade. A lot less tolerant than they are at the younger stages. I forgot the other 2 questions.
Any other questions? All right.
Steve Grado, I have a comment. I don't know much about these desired forest conditions, but you are talking about more re-entry into the stand, the harvest materials, much of which may not be merchantable. Well, where are you going to get a logger to do that? Maybe you can do it in an experimental context, but in my experience, and I talk about certification, I've done it all over the country, and there aren't too many loggers around. A lot of them have gone out of business. A lot of them are the bigger organizations. They don't want to deal with smaller jobs. You're going to get some guy in there who calls himself a logger. He's going to have a chainsaw, no protective equipment, no machinery that's working, and they're going to do a lousy job on your desired forest condition setting. So you got to, when you talk about these things, you got to look at the whole picture. There are places right now that are searching for quality loggers, and that's a very important part of this, I believe.
Thank you. In the green shirt,
Dan Tweed, USGS. I guess I heard a couple of comments over lunch, mainly with regard to minimum or maximum size of the openings with regard to DFCs, and I wanted to clear up some of that. It does say in that document that at a landscape scale, no more than 10% of the forest should be in clear-cut areas larger than 7 acres. That does, by definition, imply that 10% of the area can be in clear cuts larger than 7 acres. So there is no maximum size of 7 acres associated with that. Also, from what I've been hearing is that I've been referring to those as patch cuts, and I probably should be referring to them as small clear cuts. And if that's what small clear cuts are in y'all foresters' mind, then I don't think we really have any issues, because that's, if that'll regenerate your oak, then that's part of the document and how it's being done.
Another question?
Just a quick response to Dr. Greto's comment here. As far as I know, and I'm going to look to Buddy and Jeff and the other foresters on the state and federal lands that's implementing this, we've had no problems moving sales because of volume. We've had problems moving them because we don't have a market, especially like here in Mississippi. I mean, that's a whole separate issue. The quality logging jobs have been fine. I've heard nobody tell me that they had to shut them down and send them packing because they were tearing too much up or whatever. So we have not had any of those sorts of issues, and the volume has been there, et cetera. So I don't think it could be a concern, it's a valid point, but we're not seeing it.
Well, I will say that there was a sale put up in Tinsall. We went and looked at it, and we decided not to bid on it, just because maybe it was our problem. We couldn't figure out how to cruise the darn thing. It was just patches all over the place, and we decided not to bid because we're gonna have problems coming up with a good bid.
Back here in the back, the blue shirt.
Brian Lockhart, Brian Lockhart, Forest Service here in Stoneville. One question, Jeff, I have is, do you think that 15-year reentry cycle might be too long, given the dynamics of bottom lane hardwood forests, how quickly things change?
Somebody want to respond?
Of course, Jeff didn't, the response to the disturbance varies with site and such. So the real fertile sites, real productive sites, you're gonna see an explosion of growth real quick. Sites that aren't so productive, which is really most of what remains in bottom hardwood, most of those most productive sandy loam sites are in cotton or Walmart parking lots. And so we're dealing with really mostly lower sites in the Mississippi Valley that are not at top productivity. And so we think the benefits for most wildlife are trending down by 15 years or so, 10, 12, maybe 15. And we also see canopy closure. You're getting a lot more shade, which is adverse to the intolerant species that we're trying to grow. So it's that time period when it really needs a reevaluation and likely needs another disturbance to give it another flush of sunshine to perpetuate the conditions or reestablish the conditions so that it's in such a condition to grow into those desired factors for wildlife. So, and that's about as long as you need to go. Do we get there that often, that frequently? No, none of us probably do. Very few of us do. On the re-entry, on even age management, there's intermediate thinnings. And I fail to see a difference between entering for those intermediate thinnings or entering for intermediate thinnings and uneven age management. You're still going to have multiple entries of equipment. We've got good controls on the allowable damage to residual stems. So we don't see an increase. We use a lot of temporary skid trails. Skid trails are different every time they come in. Use the same roads and such. So the multiple entries are so similar between even age and uneven age, it's a matter of how big is your regeneration hole. So we don't see that factor. We got 24 open timber sales, some $4 million. Everything we put up for bid sales. We do have people that don't bid on our sales, but we got 4 or 5 bidders on every sale, and they're asking for more. And Emil, I finally remember one of those other questions. You're not seeing that type management in places in Mississippi. I don't work there. I understand there's wildlife management areas in Mississippi and there's refuges in Mississippi. Some do some forest management, some don't. They've got different objectives with different managers. So I can't base what I do on what they do. But it means we don't all agree on what the management ought to be. So love for y'all to come to White River. We have one, maybe sometimes 2 a year. And we've sponsored the Hardwood Forestry Group twice since I've been there, and it's about time to volunteer to do that again in another year or 2. So I'd like for folks to come and have a look. We'll show you the failures. We'll show you the successes in even age regeneration and uneven age regeneration. But we got both.
In the red shirt first, and then back to back.
Jim Johnson. Brian, I guess a question to you guys that have been involved directly in research.
a gut feel, let's hypothesize or a hypothetical hole in a mixed species composition stand that was put there, a group got treatment that is an acre in size, mixed species composition, the surrounding forest community was thinned to 65 basal area thereabouts around that hole. And we had success in getting, and there were parent trees within that vicinity of that hole, and we had success in getting regeneration in that hole. And others jump in, please. Routine, not all oak site. It's an optimum site. Painting that kind of picture, what kind of timeline before subsequent treatments are going to be required, in your opinion, to nurture those seedlings on to the next step, into advanced regeneration stage? And that was part of your question to Jeff. We've had a lot of discussion beating around the bush and so on, dealing with the sustainability, and obviously that issue revolves around the ability to move those seedlings established, if successful, through that process into the canopy. So what kind of timelines? You asked Jeff frequency of treatment. He responded roughly 15 years, depending. What would be the optimum? My observations over 35 years of hardwood management in the MAV for practical purposes, depending upon species and what's around that forest and how much I've taken that surrounding forest down, and like satellite I'm getting in, I've probably got an 8 to 10 year window before the critical bottom drops out of those seedlings. But I asked that as a question, and I've shared those anecdotal observations. Anyone else that wants to jump in?
Ryan Lockhart. The canned answer to that is I don't know. One of the things with, we didn't show some of the graphs from Chad Oliver's work, the last source that we used in our presentation, because we have some questions about the methods that were used in that research, and we need to get those resolved. But he had graphs showing that in these holes or 1 acre openings or whatever size, the basic premise was that if there's any shade on red oak saplings, and he started with saplings, any shade from the residual overstory would give the more shade tolerant species a competitive advantage. That was the premise from his work, and again, he used maximum tree height growth rates instead of means, and he had some reasons for doing that. I need to study that more before I comment on that. You bring in a very good point about thinning around so that you're getting more secondary light in addition, and that may provide more advantage to the red oaks. I don't know. As I used to do to students out in the woods, Jim, you just got a box. You just got a master's or PhD research question to pursue. Now, before you go on, I had 2 other comments to make before your question.
Yeah, can we hold it just for a second? Is there a Becky Roseman in the thing? Okay, go ahead.
All right, during a break, Mike with the Theodore Roosevelt National Wildlife Refuge Complex brought up a good point that we haven't been thinking about here, and that is we're still relatively young in the effects of the levee system, roads, drainages, and all that, and the effect that may be having now on our bottomland hardwood forests. What effect is that having? The alterations in the hydrologic regimes, both above ground and below ground, are we having oak sites reverting to non-oak sites and non-oak sites reverting to oak sites? That's something that I think we need to be a little bit more aware of. As a research scientist, I don't right offhand know how to even get a handle on that question. That would take some group thinking to come up with possibilities to try and answer that question. Having said that, I can't think of what my second point was, so I'll come back to that.
All right, let's go ahead, Roger.
Just some thoughts on your question, and I can't tell you an exact year, because it'll vary by site quality and what the competitors are and whatnot, but generally, when you are getting crown closure, if you've got codominant red oaks, that's a good time to be going in and maybe doing some crop tree release around some of your individual stems. And you've all talked about an evaluation cycle, and maybe set it at 12 or 15 years. I would say that I would be monitoring those group openings sooner than 15 years, until I got a sense for my property and how things were acting. Because I think by 15 years, the oaks could be overtopped.
Any other questions before we go? All right, let's go there first, and then back.
And I'm not totally surprised with those answers. I don't know the answer to that question either. It's highly varied from one site to the next, highly varied species compositions in the surrounding forest community, and highly varied depending on how I treated that adjacent forest stand. There's a research need there, gentlemen. But the reason to ask that question in part is to identify that as a manager, we need those kind of answers. It's quite obvious from your presentation, Brian, that at age 28, those carpet seedlings had dropped out. You know, none of us should be surprised about that. That's not a function of a management system, rather that's a function of the stand simply closing out. So what is the optimum timing silviculturally for us to be considering in an uneven age management approach for those re-entries? That is a research need that we grapple with for quite some time. It's highly varied from one site to the next. And that in part gets back and addresses some of Steve's discussion and thought processes.
Turning it off. I can address your question. In the 28-year research that Johnson and Kennard did, when they went in at year 14 and 15, it's written in their notes, in their research report in the lab on file, that they were very optimistic that they had attained oak reproduction that was developing into the oak story at age 14 and 15. By age 28, the oak was gone. So you need to get in there before it starts declining. And it does not have to be another harvest. I mean, we're forgetting about vegetation control. If you get in those gaps and control some of the competition, that's something we didn't speak a lot about here. But, you know, you can maintain that oak stocking by controlling other competition until you're ready to, you know, for that final harvest to release.
Let me make one last comment on that. One way to evaluate this is look at how fast your seedlings are growing. If you've got an idea of how they were growing as soon as they were released the first time, you know about how much growth rate you're getting. And when you start seeing diminished growth rate, you better get it right then. You probably waited long enough for sure to do it.
Okay, before I go back in the back, anyone else? New topic, new anything else? Okay. Okay. Steve?
And follow up to John's comment, how do you check for vigor on oak seedlings and something in terms of getting them to develop? Ideally with oak, you want to see multiple flushing within that year. You know, most plants put out one flush of growth or they're continuous growers anyway. But with the oaks, wow.
Good time.
With the oaks, you know, seeing 2, 3 flushes of growth is a sign of vigor. But also not only with the number of flushes, but where are the leaves displayed on those seedlings? Oaks that are in shaded conditions tend to put their 4 or 5 leaves at the top of that flush and spread them around to try and maximize the amount of light they can capture. Vigorous growing oak seedlings will have leaves not only at the top, but all along that flush. Wherever there's a node at, the more vigorous the seedling, the more leaves you're going to have going up that stem to the top of that flush. And that's just a biological way of assessing the vigor of your oak seedlings that we've observed over the years. Now, I did come up with my other thinking a while ago, and that is sustainability. And I've been sitting here struggling with that word. It's a word I do not like. But one thing to keep, the way I look at sustainability is meeting the landowner objectives over the long run without affecting the quality of the system. Maintaining the integrity of the system, I guess, might be a way of putting it.
Anyone else? Any new topics? Any concern?
Dan Tweed again. One of the points that was addressed a couple of times yesterday or maybe earlier today is the issue of landscape and how the management on the landscape scale may be an alternative if we have a lot of small patches being managed through even age harvest over the landscape. Is that the same thing as a heterogeneous forest within a stand? And I said I'd make a point later on. My point is that in my mind, just because you have a lot of different age stands on the landscape, it is not the same as having a heterogeneous forest with a lot of old, large trees that are basically have those ancient forest or old growth or whatever that might conjure up in your own mind. But those characteristics are only achieved through time, and if you're continuously managing this forest without achieving those, they're not achieved on the landscape regardless of how many patches you have.
Back here in the back.
Dan Day again. I appreciate that perspective, and it challenges me to think, outside the box as a forester. So for example, it's making me think whatever the rotation age here is in even age management, can you go longer with it? And when you do regenerate the stand, can you leave some legacy trees there to fulfill some big diameter or old tree characteristics or whatnot as you regenerate the stand? And so I think there's a lot of flexibility, and we're only in our silvicultural approaches to achieve these desired features. I think it's really possible, and we're only limited by our creativity and our propensity to get stuck in our ruts in life. So I'm challenged by the discussion here, and anyways, thank you all.
New, kind of a slightly different topic, if I might ask a question. Andy, earlier, I think it was today, you mentioned the property that you have to pack a lunch to go between the oaks because of historical, harvest conditions and environmental conditions that there's just no oaks there. What do you do with properties that are like that in the MAV? We've been talking a lot about oak regeneration, but if there's no oak there to begin with, what do? If you have a property where the landowner is interested in timber income, but wildlife is a primary reason they bought the land, what do? And Andy or anyone?
You only have one alternative. If they're not there, you're gonna have to plant them. And that means you're gonna have to create some kind of an opening that's satisfactory in terms of light, water, that's suitable for the growth of those young seedlings. So if you've got a big area and you've got nothing but sugarberry, I don't care what you do in terms of cutting, all you're gonna get back is sugar beer. It doesn't matter. So if you want to increase the oaks in the stand, the only way to do it is create some openings and use artificial regeneration. That's the only way to do it. Direct seeding won't do it underneath the stand, for example. It won't do it. You have to plant the seedlings.
And that's what this landowner is doing. They have planted oak in the past, and you know, you've always got to make sure that between the levees, do you have the right site? Are you know, should oak be there? I think on Anderson Tully land, from a wildlife perspective, we're just as happy with sweet pecan at this point. It tends to meet that hard mast category. Yeah, it's not as valuable, but it ain't happening. And but when you do have, and when you do have advanced seedlings, you've got to go with the even age approach, or that is what's successful.
In the back, Jenny?
It's too bad.
If you'll wait.
Okay, I can yell.
We're
I'm
recording.
real sorry for Dr. Stevie D. It's too bad Gilbert Rose and Bill Thompson aren't here, because I think, aren't they doing some cuts and then planting oaks on their oak sites? I mean, John, I think you did a short course there, and we looked at some of their planted hardwoods, and where's Steve? He's so fast. And, you know, of course, their primary income species is trophy whitetails, so I know they're doing some of that as well.
Stay back here, Steve.
You don't need to go to the gym tonight.
I know he doesn't.
Norman, to reiterate the point you made is that not all sites are oak sites. Some of the sites that we've looked at, pHs of 8, almost 8, or maybe just a little over 8, 7.8. You might can get Shumard oak based on some research to grow there. You know, some sites are still too young to really be oak sites yet, because oaks tend to like more acidic soils. Another point I was going to make, and it's kind of overriding a lot of what we're talking about, why did the DFCs, why were they created? Well, there's concern about some of the populations of neotropical migrant birds. And as a non-bird biologist, I can see that if we have some of these species get on the endangered species list, then our management may be dictated to us instead of having the freedom still to have set our own objectives. That we may be, just like the guidelines for red-cockaded woodpeckers, we may start having guidelines forced upon us if some of these species become endangered. So we need to keep those in mind. In addition to one of my philosophies that the neotropical migrant birds help us grow timber just with the bugs they eat when they get over here. So another interesting research question.
Is Mike Chamberlain still here? Can't find him in the crowd.
He left.
He made mention on bears, we manage for bears too, about the bears were using those large cypress trees in areas he was studying. My question was going to be, were they selecting the trees because they were cypress, or were they selecting them because of the size? And I think other work will show that bears are not species specific. They, in our area, they're prone to use overcut oak because of availability, that are sized to have bear dens in them. And they'll use sweet pecan, sycamore, nut-all oak, and cypress. But I didn't want the audience to think cypress is the only thing bears are going to den in. They den in whatever is available that is sufficient size for them.
Any other questions? Well, at this point, then I'll turn it back over to our panelists first for some closing comments, and then either back to Steve and Andy and Bruce for anything they want to follow up.
So Dr. Hodges put me on the spot. Let me go first this time. I mean, it's all been good discussions this afternoon, and I think my closing would just be kind of what my opening comments were. There's still some issues, concerns, misunderstandings, etc., on the table. I think the only way we're going to fix that and move forward is through a collective approach. Whether it's everybody's now invited to the Lower Miss Joint Venture Forest Resource Working Group, or we create some joint task force, or some forum is needed such that we can all come to the table. By everybody, I mean forestry community, the wildlife community, the academics, and whoever else needs to be there, so we can talk through the different objectives and strategies. So that's my closing.
Wildlife enhancement is a very big revenue producer to our company. I mean, it's something that if there are things that we can accommodate that add to that value stream, we would like to know about it. And there are other landowners that would too. If there are positives, how positive are they? So just the reinforcement that I think there needs to be more people at the table and more research done that would be more focused on this issue.
I've got a group of 3 comments. Number one is in answer to the question you just raised. I asked him that very question at lunch, and he said yes, it was because the only big trees they had were cypress for the most part. So, and number 2 is that wildlife management pays. It really does. We've done study after study after study, and guess where it pays the most? Hardwood bottomlands. I've got at least 4 studies that we've done, and the land that drove the least prices or land prices the most with regards to recreation was hardwood bottomlands. We also know that, just finishing a study with Daryl Jones, that wildlife management pays, and the landowner, the hunters will pay for it. So if you have treatments that you want to do that will enhance wildlife management, enhance the habitat, the hunting clubs will pay for it. We've done an auction survey and auctioned off well-managed pieces of property and unmanaged pieces of property, and the hunters will pay for the difference in value to cover your costs and generate the wildlife habitat that they want. And finally, as we go forward, as I've been listening, I've been hearing sort of 2 camps: wildlife biologists and silviculturalists. There is a component missing here that you need to be aware of, and it's forest management. We keep talking about doing these treatments on a stand-by-stand basis. There is some allusion to forest level management concerns in the DFC guidelines, but you need to really approach these management activities with forest management planning in mind. How do you do these things over time, revisiting this stand? Do we provide the DFCs, at least on part of the forest, continuously, or as opposed to sequentially, manage the stand until it goes out and manage it back? Well, you can be checkerboarding that across the landscape, and that's where a good forest management component is necessary as you explore these alternatives in the future.
You just stole my comment. I would emphasize what he's saying. That's extremely important. We need to be putting more emphasis at forest level for all of this than we have done. The other thing I would say is that we're really not that far apart in terms of foresters and the wildlife biologists, because I don't know any decent forester who doesn't have a big wildlife consideration as well as forest management consideration. And basically, I'd say 2 things we need to do. One is get the landowners, more landowners involved in making this decision. We're talking about pushing this to involve private landowners, we got to have more input from them, not just the wildlife biologists and the foresters, but the landowner himself. And I guarantee you that landowner's interested in it at the forest level, not just the stand level. So he's going to be interested in what's happening overall as far as for the long run. And senior moment, guys. That's all.
I want to make one comment as a deer ecologist manager. A lot of emphasis on hardwood regeneration, oak regeneration. As a deer manager, I look at acorns as a wonderful thing for deer, just like that beach copper was a wonderful thing to end my lunch with. But I better not be feeding the deer beach copper all the time. They're gonna eat that 2 to 3 months out of the year. My job is to produce forage on the ground, within 5 feet of the ground, not acorns. And if you focus just on acorns, you're missing the boat on deer management.
Just one last comment I wanted to make. There again, I want to thank Andy and Bruce for inviting me to do this. I was a little apprehensive coming in because in my last three or 4 years at Louisiana, one of my jobs was chairman of the Louisiana Reptile and Amphibian Task Force. And we had to look at management plans for Louisiana pine snake, Gulf Coast box turtle, two-toed amphihumas, and I'm telling you, they were a lot further apart than y'all are. So I think there's something that y'all can get together on fairly quickly. Thank you.
Well, Bruce said since he started it, I had to close it out. I'm smart enough, and I've done enough meetings to realize that when it gets to the end of the second day, a storm is rolling in. These comments better be pretty brief. So that's what they're going to be. I'd first of all like to thank Jimmy Avery for doing the moderator. Round of applause. If you will look around your chairs, you will notice there's no blood on the floor anywhere. That wasn't necessarily the way we saw it, you know. So that worked out pretty well. I appreciate it, Jimmy. Well done all the way through. We did accomplish what we started out to do. We provided an opportunity for an exchange of information. You have heard 2 days of commentary, discussion. You've heard a lot of information presented. Some of it was research, some of it was not. But you have heard multiple aspects, all addressing the same basic resource and how we go at it. In a perfect world, your desired forest management or for forest species would achieve the exact wildlife habitat parameters that you're looking for. I'm not sure that we can't do that. I think that in many cases, we can have our cake and eat it too. You may not be able to have all your cake, you may not be able to eat it all at one time, but I think you can blend this. I don't think it all has to be one way or the other. I think we can work together and get to that point. I appreciate the fact that everybody has been open and sharing. I appreciate the time that you took to travel here today and discuss this. I don't know where we will go from here. I don't know if this is going to generate another meeting in the future, but certainly we have started. We have laid the groundwork for future discussions and for, I think, a nice progression moving toward a productive end. Everyone be safe in your travels home. Thanks for coming.